Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session on creating the crime of ecocide as possibly an effective tool to address climate and environmental crisis. My name is Maud Sarliev. I will be moderating this session. I just wanted to start by reminding the audience that you may ask questions using the Q&A tab. And then it will be moderated and sent through us via me. So just to give you a brief introduction, so this session is going to discuss the creation of the crime of ecocide. The term ordinarily refers to the destruction of the environment at the detriment of life. And there is a general movement these days of activists, campaigners, politicians all over the world who consider that incriminating ecocide could be a solution to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. So this session will explore that particular issue through 4 issues. The first one is the gaps in international law, in current international law and the legal framework. The second is the threshold, the difference between ecocide as such and regular or common, in inverted brackets, environmental crimes. The third will be looking at the challenges attached to the definition, and the fourth will discuss the most appropriate forum. Today, we're very honored by the presence of 4 amazing and prestigious panelists. Faja Shoutenkova, who hopefully will join us a bit later. Nimo Bassi, Justice Twiloma Neroli-Slade, and MEP Marie Toussaint. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of each of you before handing the floor. So Faja is a human rights lawyer. She's an active advocate for the protection of human rights and rights of the indigenous people, particularly in West Papua, where she's committed to securing and promoting fundamental rights and freedom of the people of West Papua. She's also a member of the advisory board of the Stop Ecocide campaign. Nimo Bassi is an architect, a writer, and a poet. He's the director of an ecological think tank, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, which has its head office in Benin City in Nigeria. He's a member of the steering committee of Oil Watch International and was chair of Friends of the Earth International. He's also a member of the advisory board of Stop Ecocide Foundation and has written a number of articles, books, and various publications in relation to the issues we'll be discussing today. Justice Slade was one of the first elected judges at the International Criminal Court in The Hague from 2003. He has served extensively in Samoa, the Pacific region, and internationally as Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat based in Fiji, as Samoa's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations based in New York, and concurrently ambassador to the USA and to Canada, as well as a senior counsel in the legal division of the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, and also as Attorney General in Samoa. Justice Slade and then last but not least, Marie Toussaint, who is a French environmental activist, a jurist in international environmental law, co-founder of the association Notre Affaire à tous, and at the origin of the very famous, at least in France, case of the century, or l'affaire du siècle, and beyond, I think beyond France. She was elected a member of the European Parliament and the Greens group in May 2019 and sits on the Committee for Energy, Industry, Environment and Legal Affairs. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. So the idea was to start with the gaps in international law. I will give you a brief introduction in that respect. I think that when it comes to ecocide, the idea that the movement is pushing towards is to include ecocide as a fifth crime to the existing crimes provided for under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. As most of you already know, you have, as the Rome Statute stands, the crimes, the four categories of crimes, sorry. The crime of genocide, the crime of the crimes against humanity, sorry, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. None of these crimes are dealing with environmental damages per se, except for one provision under war crimes, which defines which scope is really, really limited, and which requirements are incredibly difficult to demonstrate from a prosecution's perspective. That said, there are a number of attempts further to the strategic paper published by the Prosecution's Office of the International Court in 2016, and even before. A number of communications have been filed looking at the impact of environmental crimes on civilian population. And these initiatives have contributed in flagging how important this impact can be, and the legal vacuum that exists with, or some argue exists with respect to environmental crimes not being defined as such in the Rome Statute. The reason for that is because during the time of its negotiation, the focus was more on the impact on civilian population, on human beings and mankind, rather than the environment. And that's probably also connected to the fact that at the time, before 98, where the Rome Statute was finalized, and within the forum of the International Law Commission in the 80s and the 70s, the idea that the environment threats against the environment were so severe was not as key and a source of concern as it is today. I think that's another way that the Rome Statute has been used to flag the legal vacuum regarding environmental crimes is through more recent communications, more recent submissions filed with respect to attacks, crimes against humanity, or alleged crimes against humanity, involving attacks against indigenous people in Brazil in particular, but perhaps other communications, other submissions, because they are not public for the most part, concern also other groups of indigenous people, such as in West Papua. But the reason for that, and the reason I think why the focus has been on indigenous people, is because these groups of population are targeted because as a result of their culture, their traditions, and the role they play in the protection of the environment, and also because their very existence depends on the environment being their habitat. And the best example of that is what's been happening in the recent years in the Amazon and even before. So I think in a nutshell, that gives you perhaps an idea of what is there in terms of international provisions with the Rome Statute. Beyond the Rome Statute, you have a number of MEAs, Multilateral Environmental Agreements, sorry, I'm used to the acronym, which deal with behaviors, conducts, and consider they should be criminalized. But there are as their name indicates, multilateral, so they require transposition into domestic laws. They're not coercive per se. And other than that, you have about 10 domestic jurisdictions so far, which already incriminates ecocide. To my knowledge, in Vietnam and a lot of ex-Soviet countries, but to my knowledge, no actual case have been so far investigated and prosecuted to the point that they were brought to trial. So in a nutshell, that's the landscape of ecocide laws, and the progress, perhaps the improvements that could be made and developed to better protect the environment and to also assist in the fight against climate change. And that said, I think it's probably better for me to hand the floor to Nemo, who will be telling you, based on his experience, field experience and observations and expertise in having observed a wide range of environmental crime, what could be a threshold between regular common environmental issues or environmental damages and the level of environmental of ecocide per se. So please, Nemo.
Thank you so much for that introduction. The issues are really very, very deep and very wide, and sometimes it may be impossible or difficult for people who have not experienced ecocide to imagine what it could be, because it's a crime that is actually unthinkable. It's the kind of damage that we see, and I've had the unfortunate privilege of visiting heavily degraded locations in Africa and elsewhere. And it's always, every time it's mind-numbing, just wondering, how could anyone ever permit a thing like this to happen? Let me be, basically, the bottom line for me is whenever there is extensive ecological damage that would take probably a lifetime, 2 lifetimes to repair, that to me is clearly ecocide. When an environment is so damaged that people cannot live comfortably in that location, when people cannot carry out their normal livelihoods, their culture is impacted, their spirituality is subverted, the environment simply doesn't support life anymore. Clearly doesn't support life anymore. That to me is ecocide. And we've heard about places being labeled as topmost polluted, contaminated places on Earth. Those are clearly locations that you can attribute the crimes of ecocide to. And some time ago, I visited Witbank in South Africa. Witbank is one of the locations that has a lot of coal mines. And it's a place where coal mines have been abandoned for decades, but there was fire in the coal mines underground. And so when you walk in the fields in that territory, you are walking over caves of fire. And sometimes a sinkhole will appear and you dumps you right into fire. For anyone to have created those mines, the mining itself, the activity of excavating, of taking out that mine and creating the condition for what is occurring there now, for fire that goes on for years, that to me is nothing less than ecocide. So ecocide is truly a crime against the environment, but not just that, it's a crime against Mother Earth and all her children, including human beings. Now, I come from the Niger Delta, and I've done work extensively in the Niger Delta, living in Niger Delta. And for over 6 decades, crude oil has been exploited in commercial quantities, commercial levels. And the entire process of crude oil exploration, extraction, and transportation and utilization, every single part of those activities, every period or part of it is destructive. Exploration may seem like something benign and easy, but if you carry out seismic activities in water bodies, especially when you have big sea mammals. You are actually either destroying the habitat or causing disorientation and the death of those sea animals. That is a high level of degradation that may not measure to ecocide. But when you have oil spills consistently in a community for decades, that is ecocide. And I'll give you one example. In 2011, the United Nations Environment Program issued a report on the assessment of Ogoni environment. And in many locations, they showed that hydrocarbon pollution had gone as deep as 5 meters into the soil. This is soil in which people farm. The soil in people are buried when they die. It's a soil in which people can do all other kinds of activities, was polluted to a depth of 5 solid meters. That was in 2011. By 2020, when I visited one of those locations where remediation efforts have been attempted, the pollution had gone as deep as 10 meters. 10 meters of pollution into the soil. That to me is ecocide. It looks like you could remediate that kind of location, but a lot of what is being remediation is not the same thing as restoration. Many of the pollutions, when they are remediated, still leave scars that cannot be eliminated. And when you have such a mark, anyone has such a mark on Mother Earth, that person has a mark that will not disappear, that cannot be eliminated. That to me is a criminal activity in that range. Now, talk about going to a community and you see the entire water body is covered by crude oil, or a village surrounded by a ring of crude oil, which sometimes is set on fire. Then you have a ring of fire burning around a territory, and then all the aquatic life forms are gone. People can no longer understand the environment. And then you have also, in some other places, big gas furnaces in oil fields at oil flow stations where oil is separated from water and gas that burn for decades nonstop. Not the one that burns occasionally to relieve pressure in the oil wells, but the one that is just economic waste, that nobody cares about the economic value and nobody cares about the environment. So you have this gas being burned, releasing toxic elements that cause cancers, bronchitis, asthma, that cause skin diseases, that cause acid rain, and this goes on for decades. People can no longer enjoy a quiet night. People cannot sit outside their homes and tell stories in moonlight. People cannot have a romantic gaze at the moon. I mean, they cannot enjoy the moon anymore because of this heinous criminal fire. These are all acts of ecocide. So the threshold for me should be very low. We don't need to take it so high that those who are committing these crimes will say, well, we haven't reached that level. We have not, the environment is not totally dead. But there are actually some locations that I know that will not recover in 5 lifetimes.
Thank you,
Nemo. I don't
Nemo.
want to say forever, but they may recover after 1,000,000 years. So these are some of the things that I would just put on the table at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nemo. So what I gather from your very interesting intervention is that a lot of the examples that you've provided to us relate to the exploitation of resources and the consequences it has on a long-term basis. And perhaps before we move on to the challenges attached to the definition of the incrimination of ecocide, perhaps Faja could tell us very briefly how this could apply to the situation in Papua and the impact of exploitation of illegal or legal exploitation of resources could impact on indigenous people in perhaps 5 minutes. We can't hear you. Your mic is...
Thank you, Maud. 5 minutes. Well, in West Papua, being the western half of the island New Guinea and the current Indonesian provinces Papua and West Papua, we can see a clear example of the crime of ecocide committed against the indigenous peoples. From the moment that they were decolonized, you may say again, by Indonesia, there was the exploitation of what was already soon discovered the largest gold and copper mine of the world. And because of the exploitation of the mine, you can see by the toxic sediments that there is deforestation, large deforestation, and the livelihoods of the indigenous Papuan people around the Grasberg mine. If you Google Grasberg mine, you will see the devastating destruction which is caused by this exploitation of gold and copper by the American-owned business Freeport-McMoRan. So but what really is difficult is that the indigenous people don't have any effective remedy to stand up against the destruction made. So national and international provisions might be in place, and there on a national level, there are environmental, water, and pollution standards to be met by the companies, but there is no prosecution of these companies. Of course, Indonesia is also, as a UN member, obliged to follow the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to have free and to provide free, prior, and formal consent before taking any land, traditional land, for the exploitation of mines or palm oil as well. But this is and also it's also implemented in the national law, but it's not effective. So we do need a remedy on an international level. And that's why I'm also involved in the Stop Ecocide campaign, which was launched by the late Polly Higgins, and which wants to have the fifth crime in the Rome of Statute, an amendment to implement ecocide as the fifth crime in the Statute of Rome. So that is a very important thing, I think, to have an effective measures for the indigenous peoples in West Papua and also around the world, because indigenous peoples around the world officially are 6.2% of the world's population, but they are the ones who protect the 80% of the biodiversity in the world. So it's very important that the indigenous people who are most likely to be affected by these, by ecocide, by green crimes, that they are also protected by the international law. And that, I think, that is where an amendment of the Rome Statute would come into place and would help and support the indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much, Fajar. I think you're absolutely right. Although perhaps some of the provisions of the Rome Statute, as it is right now, could and have, I think, some organizations have tried to use them to show how environmental destruction impacts on indigenous people and how indigenous people can arguably be considered as targeted as a result, but perhaps indeed the definition of a crime of ecocide could assist in that respect. And for that, I would like to hand the floor to Justice Slade, who could, with all his experience as a former ICC judge and all his other incredible experience in his various roles, would I'm sure will be in a fantastic position to tell us a little bit more about the challenges attached to providing a definition for this crime. Oh, your mic is still off. You have to go on the.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I am a member of the international panel, and if I may, I would note from the outset that what I say is very much my own personal perspective, not that of the international panel. The substantive challenge is that as yet there is no real measure of universal acceptance or formalized opportunity to test out the parameters of the concept and meaning of ecocide. We need then, I think, to produce a definition that is clear and acceptable to the wider world, and above all, to comply with the character and the rules of the Rome Statute. There will be complexities, certainly, but this does not mean the creation of ecocide de novo. The confronting crises we are all well known and long-standing. We just listened to Nemo Bassi, as are the concerns over ecocide, which is closely associated with the appalling wartime use of chemicals, particularly in Vietnam and Cambodia. At the very first major United Nations Conference on the Environment in Stockholm, 1972, the terminology of ecocide was expressed publicly at a high-level political setting by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. Over the years since, we have had report upon report from the Brundtland Commission, the United Nations and its agencies, UNEP, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and many others on the extensive environmental catastrophes worldwide. A few months ago, we had another major global assessment on critical biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the Living Planet Report 2020 on serious biodiversity loss. Indeed, just recently, we had news of the Multilateral Files report, drawn from recently declassified and official documents exposingly consistently underestimated and devastating impacts of nuclear testing at the Mururoa and the Fangatafu atolls in French Polynesia, where 193 nuclear tests were conducted over a span of 30 years, with still unknown environmental consequences, not only to that country, but also to other neighboring Pacific countries like my own. The dangers of nuclear weapons for humanity and the environment were points of serious and often animated debate and disagreement at the ICC Rome Conference 1998, as they were when dozens of concerned states, like my own country, gathered in The Hague in 1995 to seek the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in the milestone case on nuclear weapons. One notable result of the Rome Conference is the criminalization of an intentional attack on the natural environment as a war crime, causing widespread, long-term, and severe damage in the context of an international armed conflict and in the circumstances of Article 8, which you have already referred to, Madam Moderator. This was a compromise provision agreed in Rome, albeit with a very high threshold levels of proving the essential elements. It will be very difficult, as you have said. However, of particular importance for our purpose, I think the idea of criminalizing an attack on the environment is there now in the statute. We need, I think, the perspective of history, and remember the ICC expresses the abhorrence of humanity over the atrocities of the Second World War, and that the development of the ICC as a court occupied many decades of extensive international debate and discussion. So in defining the crime of ecocide, we will not have the benefit of that at all. It is important also to keep in mind the endeavors of the international community in so many World Summary conferences on the environment in the past 50 years or so, from the foundational Stockholm Conference 1972 to many others subsequently. In particular, I think it is important to remember the global consensus that have been achieved. For example, is under the Climate Change Convention agreed at the Rio Earth Summit 1992 on stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. The stabilization level agreed and aimed for under the Paris Agreement, as we all know, is a temperature rise limited to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Remember also the very critical leadership role of a deeply committed and knowledgeable non-governmental organization and civil society community in the creation and functioning of the ICC, and especially in what today now seems to be a vastly growing international force for the addition of the crime of ecocide. Leadership by so many of the people now on this very panel, Madam Chair. I think there's need for clear understanding of the notion of the environment. Are we dealing with the environment in planetary terms or regionally, or is there need for particularity to focus, for example, on environmental impacts and consequences on specific regions or groups like indigenous communities? And you've already covered that, as Faja and Bassi have done so. The Rome Statute does not define the term natural environment used in Article 8, but there may be other sources, including the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in the nuclear weapons case, for example. And I quote, "The environment is not an abstraction, but represents the living space, the quality of life, and the very health of human beings, including generations unborn," unquote. More particularly, there seems to be significant force and growing acceptance of an ecocentric approach centered on non-human interest and the rights of the natural environment of itself. The centrality and respect for the environment is substratum in the spiritual and the cultural life of so many indigenous communities around the world. The ICC, of course, is the first permanent court created to deal with the most serious crimes of global concern, which have been mentioned: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression, and a fifth when the crime of ecocide is accepted. The court is treaty-based and exists by the agreement of the presently 123 countries which are state parties to the Rome Statute. It follows that no matter how perfect the legal and technical drafting, the ecocide definition will need to satisfy the policy and political requirements of sovereign member states of the ICC. That is just the reality. The crucial challenge then for the international panel, I think, is to ensure a natural fit for the crime of ecocide, that is to ensure cohesion and integrity, and that the definition of ecocide accords with the legal character and philosophy of the ICC system. The court is, of course, a court of law, bound by the principle of legality and other general principle of international criminal law, and definitions of crimes need to be construed strictly. The court's jurisdiction is limited to the most serious crimes and limited also to cover only natural persons and individuals who commit these crimes, not states or corporate entities. It is important to note that the Rome Statute functions prospectively, not retroactively. So adding a new crime of ecocide will not provide a remedy for past attacks on the environment. There cannot be any false hopes on that score. In the drafting process, it is necessary to consider essential lessons to be gained from the international work and negotiation on the activation of the court's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. That experience points to the need to amend Article 5 of the Rome Statute to add ecocide as the fifth crime, and possibly other associated amendments as well. Madam Chair, under the Article 121, which deals with amendments, the addition of the crime of ecocide will apply only to those states which accept the amendments relating to ecocide, not to all states parties to the statute. Yet another reality. we need also to understand, as we know from the aggression experience, that the process of amending the statute overall is complex and is likely to involve significant time and effort. Now, Madam Moderator, I believe there is a necessary and effective role for criminalization, and that the moment is right to harness the power of international criminal law. The creation of the crime of ecocide is essentially part of the ICC process of Rome, and in that sense is the unfinished business of Rome. Having ecocide as an ICC crime will, I believe, contribute substantively to the moral authority of the court and its true purpose. Purpose that is to serve as deterrence against the grave crimes which threaten the peace, security, and well-being of the world. The court, remember, was created for the sake of present and future generations, and the creation of the crime of ecocide, very much in line with the theme of this important conference, calls for vision and renewed legal thinking. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Justice Slade, for shedding light on all these complex issues attached to the process of amending the Rome Statute, defining the crimes of ecocide and all it should cover as a result, and putting everything in perspective. It was really, really useful for all of us, I think. With respect to the remarks that everybody has made, so far it's been concentrated on the International Criminal Court being the ideal forum for that. Now, the question that I would like to pose to Marie, to our European Parliament member now, is whether you think that the ICC is indeed a good forum, whether it's the best forum to investigate and prosecute this type of crime, and to share with us your experience since you've been campaigning and advocating for and working on this incrimination for many years now. What are your thoughts on the idea of perhaps an international environmental tribunal or another forum or any other idea and regarding the prosecution and investigation of this crime?
Yes, thank you, Maud. Thanks for this introduction. Thanks also for this invitation, and I'm quite honored actually to be speaking with these three very important speakers for whom I have a lot of admiration. So thanks also for all your insights and testimonies and interventions. So yeah, this is a good question, whether the ICC is the right level for the recognition and condemnation of ecocide. But what I want to say is that, as we saw with the precedent speakers, we are living in such a climate, biodiversity, planetary boundaries emergency, that we have to think over what is the quickest way and what is the most efficient way to recognize and condemn ecocide. And there has been a discussion among all the supporters of ecocide in the last years and decades on where this should be recognized. And we have to think over the fact that ecocide was already discussed before and during the redaction of the Roma Statute. It disappeared because some of the most important member states didn't want it politically inside. For instance, France, which I'm French, which is where I come from, because of the nuclear power. But this was one of the first cynical where the recognition of ecocide was discussed. And so it makes sense that, you know, now that we are in such an emergency, we are trying to recognize it there and to ascribe it in the Roma Statute. But the ICC has other good qualities for being the place where we recognize ecocide. First thing is the adoption of an amendment is quite simple. Well, Justice Slade talked about the difficulties of the definition, of course, and also how we can define the sanctions. But there are already mechanisms. There is an habit of this court, which is functioning for a few years now, even 2 decades. And there are some financial resources, human resources. So this has a lot of convenience, but also we only need one member state to present an amendment once we have worked on definition. And, you know, majority of states supporting it to inscribe it really into the Roma Statute, which is politically, and I will come back to that afterwards, in the international arena, a quite simple way, a quite simple mechanism. And especially when I'm a member of the European Parliament, and in the European Union, we have such difficult mechanisms to decide over anything that, you know, the mechanism of the ICC to bring a new amendment is quite easy and it can be quite efficient. What's more is that the EU represents 22% of the state parties, which means that if a regional group like the EU and all its member states want to support the recognition of ecocide, if we manage to get it from the EU, and we are working on it, it can be done quite easily, because then we would have a strong group pushing for its recognition. There are other advantages. For instance, well, once it's written in the Roma Statute, then the state parties must adapt it in international law. And normally, in theory, you have a universal jurisprudence. So you can apply this crime, whatever it would be committed in this country or in another. And of course, this has both a symbolic force, because it belongs to the crimes against mankind, the most important crimes. So this is also a global symbolic recognition, which is really important to say these are the greatest crimes, and this must not be disregarded. This is absolutely important. But they also have a leading effect, in the meaning that, you know, if it's written in the Roma Statute of the ICC, then other countries, such as in the United States, who are not members of the Roma Statute, will most certainly finish by adopting it in their law. But what I also want to say, and that's the first message I want to say, is that we have to work real hard in order for the ecocide to be recognized at the International Criminal Court level. But we cannot wait for it to be done before acting. And we cannot stop at the ICC level for 3 main reasons. The first one is that we have to remember that penal law is a real issue of national sovereignty. And we have to put in question the dogma of national sovereignty when it comes to the global commons, because by nature they are global and they threaten all humanity. But this is really hard. And even about nature and living resources, we still call them resources, by the way. And this is quite hard to find an agreement. So we must not, you know, despite all the good steps that we are making right now, we must not forget that this is going to be difficult. Once it's going to come on the table and member parties will have to decide for real, this is still going to be difficult and it can take a long time. Whereas we are living this emergency that needs us to react, you know, really, really more quickly. Also, one of the fears that we can have is that some state parties today of the ICC could withdraw from the ICC because of ecocide. I'm wondering whether the Brazil from Jair Bolsonaro would stay if ecocide is recognized. Well, he's facing other complaints, right? So we'll see how it goes. But this is one of the concerns that we may have also, that we must have in this work. The second reason is because of the ICC itself. And first of all, because, as I said before, the US, but also other state parties are not members of the ICC, and that, you know, we cannot just satisfy ourselves with the members of the ICC. The ICC also has means, financial or human, but limited means. And we can see that its relevance and its legitimacy is constantly questioned at the international level. And as long as I believe that the recognition of ecocide would break a bit the picture of a post-colonial establishment in post-colonial courts, because it was changed a bit the approach and the cases that are being well, the persons were being sued, right? There is still this reticency to trust the ICC. Maybe the last point about the ICC is that, as for now, it is not really open to people and to NGOs to reach out to it. I mean, it's possible, but it's quite hard. And also, it condemns individuals and not companies. And as long as it concerns ecocide, we have to find ways. So my ideal would be that we can change the ICC also in that direction, right? Because ecocides are not the only crimes which are committed by companies. So, we can also improve the functioning of the ICC. So what would be the other places? Well, one of the other places where we could sue ecocide at international level would be to have an international convention. And it was proposed in France by a group of lawyers who wrote a report for the Ministry of Justice in 2015. And they were suggesting that France would take the lead for an international convention on ecocide. And this could be added to an international court on ecocide or on environmental law. But there again, it's quite long to get everyone to agree to something. And then who is everyone? Because 2 countries is sufficient to make an international treaty, right? So can we have all the countries around the table? How long will we take before we agree on a definition, before we agree on sanctions, before we agree on mechanisms? And how long will it come to be alive? And that's where the ICC has this advantage, right? Because it's already working, we can change it easily. So, it's better, it's most efficient to my mind to work in that direction. So yeah, this solution might not be the best one either. So what we're trying to do with the International Alliance of Parliamentarians for the Recognition of Ecocide that I launched last October is to work at all different levels. So we are, of course, pushing for the ecocide to be recognized at the ICC level. And we will keep on pushing, even though we have the same problems as for this meeting, which is very different time slots, right, where we live. So it's quite difficult to get everyone around the table at the same time. But we will keep on pushing for the recognition of ecocide at ICC level, also through our different parliaments. But we won't stop there, and we'll also try to get it recognized in our national, local, depending on the countries, right? But national and regional, like the European Parliament levels. Because we cannot wait for the recognition of ecocide at international level. It has to be done in the quickest way possible. And this we can do by working at our levels as well. Also because the recognition of ecocides in the member parties will help and facilitate its adoption at the ICC level, right? It's a bit like in the EU law. If many different member states have one penal disposition, then it's easier, and it's even a condition for a crime to be recognized at EU level. And environment is often bringing innovations, but it's still easier, to have the crime recognized in your state and not without waiting for it to be recognized by different states at the same time. So it could be way easier, and of course, we can imagine, but it would mean that we would take a long time before the recognition of ecocide. That if it's recognized in many states, different states, then we could also have a customary international law. But I prefer to be quite pragmatic there and to think that, of course, if Belgium, if France, if Sweden, if Spain is involved in the recognition of the crime of ecocide at national level, then it would ease a lot the process of the recognition of ecocide at EU level. And as I said before, since the EU is 22% of the member states, of the member parties of the Roma Statute, then it would help also the recognition of ecocide at the ICC. So we have to work at all levels, and of course also in the streets and in the civil society, and also with companies. But of course, it's the states still recognize and create law. So we really need to work at this level. But this would be efficient only at one condition, And that's why it's so important that we have this type of conferences with people who are acting in different countries. And that's why this International Alliance of Parliamentarians is so important, is that we need to recognize ecocide and to push for the recognition of ecocide in quite the same terms. And we need to have a same philosophy behind the recognition of ecocides. We need to want the same acts, type of damages to nature, to the planet, to be condemned. And we need to have close definitions. I say close because it can vary a bit depending on the legal traditions of the countries, but we need to have very close definitions and also very close sanctions. And this is the condition in which we could, through the recognition of national and regional levels, help and accelerate the recognition at the international level.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this fantastic overview of the possibilities regarding and challenges or opportunities attached to the forum and to the various jurisdictions. It's been incredibly interesting to also see how each of you have different perspective, different approach, but are all involved and committed to making this idea move forward. And we have a little bit of time, I think, for a Q&A session. I think I'm just checking, perhaps 10 minutes or so. A little bit less. So if there are any questions, it's I'm just being informed that there's not much time for questions, but everybody is invited to continue the conversation by clicking on the button which indicates continue the conversation. Before we move on to that, I wanted to ask all our speakers if they had any additional remarks to make within the next few minutes on all the topics which we've covered so far. I see Fatja.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you all for your contributions. What I would like to add to what Marie just told, for how which forum could be could contribute to make the crime of ecocide possible to prosecute. I must say that unfortunately the indigenous perspective is missing in that respect also, because of the fact that nowadays we have a state-designed legal framework in which states are the actors, and indigenous people haven't been involved that much in the drafting of the current treaties. And so that's one thing that maybe should also be taken into account in this movement for ecocide. And that's something which I'm involved in as well. That is in the Congress of Nations and States, in which we try to create a new legal framework in which indigenous nations and states participate equally. And so that's I think something that's also must be taken into account, because as I said before, because indigenous peoples are also most likely to be affected by the crime of ecocide. So that was something I would like to add as a last word. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatja. If there aren't any questions or additional comments, I would like to conclude this session by again thanking every one of you who have attended, participated, and all the speakers who accepted the invitation, as well as the incredible team behind the annual meeting who have worked days and nights over the last few months even to make this happen and to make sure that everything would be going very smoothly. A special thanks to Justice Slade, who woke up very, very early this morning from New Zealand and joined us at 5 a.m. To share his thoughts on ecocide. So again, thank you so much. It's been really interesting and enlightening to hear your thoughts and ideas and comments on the issues attached to the incrimination of ecocide, the gaps, the threshold, the definition, the forum. And again, I invite you to continue the conversation by joining the Zoom meeting that should be indicated, if I'm not mistaken. Again, I look at my notes on the button somewhere, so I'm sure you can see it on your screen. And I'll see you there. So thanks very much, and hopefully see you when we continue the conversation.